They said it was chaos. Newspapers mocked it as emotional frenzy. Critics called it disorder. Some even claimed it was deception. In 1906, reporters described strange scenes coming from a broken-down building on Azusa Street. People crying, praying loudly, and speaking in languages they had never learned. But here's the part that raises eyebrows. Before the crowds, before the headlines, before the controversy, there was a kitchen, not a cathedral, not a revival tent, not a famous pulpit, a kitchen, and at the center of it was a black woman most history books barely mention, Lucy Farrow. While names like William J. Seymour became synonymous with the Azusa Street Revival, few asked the deeper question: who helped ignite it? Who prayed before the fire fell? Who laid hands on seekers before the mission building overflowed? Who carried the experience from city to city when it was still fragile and misunderstood? Lucy Farrow's kitchen altar may have been the hidden engine behind one of the most explosive spiritual movements of the 20th century. But why did her name fade? Was it race, gender, institutional politics, or something even deeper? In this video, we uncover the untold story of the woman whose quiet prayers helped spark a global revival, and why her legacy still challenges how we define influence today. If you're ready to uncover the hidden flame behind Azusa Street, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves powerful, untold history. Now, let's step into the kitchen where the fire began. Los Angeles, 1906, before the crowds, before the newspapers mocked it, before strangers fell to their knees in dusty streets, speaking words they did not learn in school. Before all of that, there was a kitchen. History remembers the explosion. It rarely remembers the spark. When people speak of the great revival that erupted on Azusa Street, they often speak of one name, William J. Seymour. They describe the humble mission at Azusa Street Mission. They tell stories of interracial worship in an era of violent segregation. They recount the trembling, the singing, the speaking in tongues, the overwhelming sense that heaven had bent low enough to touch earth. But long before Azusa Street became a headline, something quieter was happening. And at the center of that quiet ignition was a woman named Lucy Farrow. She was not the headline preacher. She did not command the pulpit with institutional authority. Her sermons were not preserved in leather-bound volumes. Yet in a modest kitchen, in a space meant for flour, firewood, and ordinary meals, Lucy Farrow built what some would later call her kitchen altar, and that altar would help ignite a movement that would circle the globe. Lucy Farrow's story did not begin in California. It began in the American South, in the aftermath of slavery, in a nation still trembling from the Civil War and struggling under the weight of Reconstruction's promises and failures. She was born into a world where the odds were not merely stacked against her. They were designed to contain her. A black woman, poor, living in a time when racial violence was not an exception, but a system, and yet, something within her refused containment. Lucy's early life is not documented in exhaustive detail, and that silence itself speaks volumes about how history often erases women like her. But what we do know is this: she became deeply connected to the holiness movement, a spiritual stream emphasizing sanctification, purity, and total surrender to God. Holiness was not a Sunday accessory. It was a consuming fire. She became associated with Charles Fox Parham, a controversial but pivotal figure in early Pentecostal theology. Parham had begun teaching that speaking in tongues was the biblical evidence of what believers called the baptism in the Holy Spirit. For many, this was theological theory. For Lucy Farrow, it became lived reality. It is said that she herself experienced speaking in tongues in Houston, becoming one of the early carriers of what would later erupt on Azusa Street. But what made Lucy unique was not merely that she had the experience. It was that she carried it like a flame. We often imagine revival beginning in cathedrals. We imagine stained glass and choirs and organized liturgy. But the story of Azusa Street does not begin that way. When Lucy traveled to Los Angeles, she did not arrive as a celebrity preacher. She arrived as a servant, even working as a nanny for the family of Charles Parham at one point. She was accustomed to being unseen, uncelebrated, unrecorded. Yet in private spaces, homes, small gatherings, prayer circles, something began to stir. And it was in a kitchen that Lucy Farrow began to pray with unusual intensity. The kitchen altar was not a literal stone structure. It was the corner of a room, a place where kneading bread gave way to kneeling bodies, where cooking fires became symbols of spiritual fire. In that kitchen, Lucy prayed for the outpouring of the Spirit. She prayed for hunger. She prayed for boldness. She prayed for a people who would not merely attend church but encounter God. And those who entered that space reported something different. Not hype, not performance, presence. There are testimonies that Lucy laid hands on seekers and they began speaking in tongues. That her prayers seemed to unlock something dormant in others. That she carried authority without spectacle. Authority born not from platform, but from altar. And that is where the story begins to change. Before Azusa Street became the epicenter of revival, there were house meetings. Small, inconvenient, unpolished gatherings. One such meeting was held on Bonnie Brae Street in Los Angeles. The prayer meeting swelled beyond the capacity of the house. The porch collapsed under the weight of hungry seekers pressing in. People stood outside, peering through windows, and what they witnessed stunned them. Men and women speaking in tongues, weeping openly, testifying with trembling voices. Many historians focus on Seymour's leadership in these meetings, and rightly so. But accounts suggest Lucy Farrow was instrumental in praying for individuals who received the experience of spirit baptism during those early days. Her kitchen prayers had not stayed confined to the kitchen. They were spilling into the streets. And soon, the gatherings moved to a dilapidated building on Azusa Street, a former stable turned mission hall. No stained glass, no grand architecture, just wooden planks and expectation. But something had already been prepared. The fire had already been kindled. Why does this matter? Because history tends to celebrate the explosion and forget the intercession. We celebrate movements. We overlook the hidden rooms. Lucy Farrow represents the unseen labor behind spiritual awakening. The hands that pray before the hands that preach. The tears that fall before the testimonies rise. In a segregated America, where black women were expected to remain silent, Lucy built an altar where heaven seemed to listen. And that altar did not stay contained. What began as a private consecration would soon become a public eruption. But as Azusa Street begins to gather momentum, as newspapers begin to criticize and crowds begin to multiply, tension will rise, because not everyone welcomed what was happening. And the question will soon shift from what is this, to who has the authority to carry this fire. In the next section, we will step into the early days of the Azusa Street Revival itself, where Lucy Farrow's quiet authority meets public controversy, and where the kitchen flame becomes a global blaze. The house on Bonnie Brae Street could no longer contain it. What began as a prayer meeting had become something volatile, something alive. The porch had collapsed under the weight of people pressing in. Neighbors complained, crowds spilled into the yard. Some mocked, others trembled, many simply stared, unsure what language could explain what they were witnessing. Now the fire was out in the open. As the gatherings outgrew Bonnie Brae, the group relocated to Azusa Street, a neglected building, a former African Methodist Episcopal church structure, later used as a stable and storage facility. The address would become synonymous with revival, Azusa Street Mission. It was not impressive. The floors were rough, the ceiling sagged. Crates served as pulpits. Planks were laid across barrels for makeshift seating. There was no choir loft. In a time when women, especially black women, were rarely allowed visible spiritual authority, Lucy operated with a freedom that defied social expectation. Azusa Street was not just a spiritual disruption, it was a social one. Perhaps the most shocking feature was not the tongues, it was the integration. In 1906 America, racial segregation was law in much of the country. Yet inside the Azusa Street Mission, black and white worshippers knelt side by side. Women preached, immigrants testified. The revival erased categories that society enforced. Newspapers ridiculed it. One Los Angeles paper described the meetings as weird babblings and a disgraceful intermingling of races. But inside the mission, something else was happening. People wept together. They sang in languages they did not study. Lucy Farrow's presence in this environment was profound. She embodied the very contradiction the revival represented. A black woman exercising spiritual authority over people who, outside those walls, would have been forbidden even to sit beside her. Wherever fire burns, smoke rises. Not everyone embraced what was happening at Azusa Street. One of the most vocal critics was Charles Fox Parham. He publicly distanced himself. Tensions mounted. But Lucy Farrow did not retreat. She traveled during this period, carrying Azusa beyond Azusa. Lucy was not always at the pulpit. She did not found an institution bearing her name, yet she functioned as a conduit. She carried the experience of spirit baptism from Houston to Los Angeles. Her kitchen altar had cultivated something steady, not emotional hype, sustained fire. By late 1906, the Azusa Street Revival had become a destination. From a dilapidated building on a dusty Los Angeles street, what began at Azusa Street Mission could not remain confined to a single building, and neither could Lucy Farrow. She never built a personal monument, instead, she moved. Historical accounts suggest she traveled to Houston, Norfolk, and beyond. She faced layered barriers, racial discrimination, gender restrictions. Yet, when she ministered, those barriers dissolved. Those who build the foundation often do not control the structure once it rises. As Pentecostalism expanded, organizational structures began to form. The raw, interracial spontaneity of Azusa Street gradually faced the realities of American segregation. Lucy Farrow's name appears less frequently in the records, not because her contribution was small, but because history often prioritizes founders over catalysts. Yet at the root of that early transmission was a woman who turned a kitchen corner into holy ground. But carrying fire is costly. Travel in the early 1900s was not easy. Financial support was unstable. Social hostility toward Pentecostal expressions was intense. Many traditional churches rejected the movement outright. Lucy ministered in environments where she was welcomed one day and dismissed the next. Pentecostals were often accused of emotionalism, disorder, even heresy. Meetings were disrupted. Pastors warned congregations against attending. Newspapers mocked the phenomenon. And beyond theological criticism, racial prejudice remained constant. To preach and lay hands on white believers as a black woman was radical and controversial. Yet Lucy did not appear to temper her calling to make others comfortable. She continued, "There is something profound about that perseverance." Because revival stories often focus on the explosive beginning, they rarely explore the endurance required to sustain conviction after their headlines fade. Lucy's ministry after Azusa did not have the same dramatic spotlight, but it had depth, and depth is what sustains movements beyond emotional peaks. Today, Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity encompasses hundreds of millions of believers worldwide. From Africa to Latin America, from Asia to Europe, worship styles, prayer practices, and theological frameworks trace their roots back to the early 20th century outpourings linked to Azusa Street. The influence is undeniable, but within that vast global narrative, Lucy Farrow's name is often a footnote, if mentioned at all. And yet consider this, she was among the earliest carriers of the Pentecostal experience from Houston to Los Angeles. She prayed for seekers in the formative days before Azusa Street became historic. If revival is a tree, Lucy helped plant it. If revival is a flame, Lucy helped light it. But here is the tension that deepens the story. Why did her name fade? Why do some revival narratives center almost exclusively on male leaders, while women who labored in prayer rooms and kitchen corners remain underremembered? The answer is not simple. It involves race, gender, historical documentation, and the human tendency to simplify complex movements into singular heroes. But movements are rarely singular, they are woven. And Lucy Farrow is woven deeply into the fabric of Pentecostal beginnings. Lucy Farrow eventually faded from public prominence. Records of her later years are sparse. She did not end her life as a global celebrity preacher. But perhaps that was never her assignment. Some people are called to stand on stages. Others are called to kneel in kitchens. And sometimes, the kneeling shapes history more than the stage. As Pentecostalism continued to evolve, forming denominations, building seminaries, sending missionaries, the raw intimacy of early prayer meetings became part of sacred memory. The question for future generations would not only be how the revival began, but whether the spirit of the kitchen altar, the hidden consecration, the quiet surrender, could be sustained. Because without altar, movement becomes machinery. Without prayer, expansion becomes performance. And without the hidden flame, even the brightest blaze eventually dims. In the next section, we will examine the social and spiritual cost of Azusa Street's radical unity, and how Lucy Farrow's life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about race, gender, and recognition within the very movement she helped ignite. Revival is beautiful, but revival is also disruptive. What happened at Azusa Street Mission was not merely a theological shift. It was a social earthquake. Men and women worshipped side by side. Black and white believers embraced in prayer. Immigrants and native-born Americans testified with equal authority. For a brief moment, the color line blurred. And standing inside that moment was Lucy Farrow, a black woman laying hands on believers in a nation still structured by segregation. That was not small. That was revolutionary. But revolutions carry consequences. Early 20th century America was rigidly divided. Jim Crow laws shaped daily life in much of the country. Social hierarchies were clear, enforced, and often violent. Yet at Azusa Street, those hierarchies cracked. Under the leadership of William J. Seymour, the mission became a space where racial integration was not merely tolerated, it was practiced. People did not sit in separate sections. They did not worship in segregated silence. They prayed together, they wept together, they spoke in tongues together. And Lucy Farrow's visible ministry enforced that equality. When she prayed for someone, she did so as a spiritual authority, not as someone asking permission to speak. This was deeply threatening to the social order. Newspapers criticized the interracial gatherings. Some ministers denounced the meetings as chaotic and improper. Critics focused as much on the racial mixing as on the theology, because what Azusa represented was not just spiritual fervor, it represented a reordering of power. As the revival matured, the initial radical unity began to face institutional pressure. Denominations began forming, doctrinal disagreements emerged, leadership structures solidified, and slowly, often subtly, racial divisions reappeared. Some Pentecostal groups separated along racial lines. Conferences were held independently. Churches developed within cultural silos. The movement that had briefly defied segregation began reflecting it. And in that shift, figures like Lucy Farrow became easier to overlook. When institutions consolidate, they often simplify history. They highlight clear founders, draft official narratives, and elevate leaders who fit traditional expectations. A black woman evangelist in early 1900s America did not fit those expectations. Her contribution did not disappear, but it receded into the margins of official storytelling. This is how erasure often happens, not through loud denial, but through quiet omission. Lucy's marginalization cannot be understood through race alone. Gender played an equally significant role. Azusa Street initially empowered women to preach, testify, and lead prayer meetings. The Spirit, participants believed, was poured out on all flesh, sons and daughters prophesied. But as Pentecostal denominations formalized, many adopted more restrictive positions on women in leadership. Gradually, preaching roles narrowed. Authority structures hardened. What was once fluid became regulated. Women who had prayed down revival found fewer platforms as institutions stabilized. Lucy Farrow's ministry thrived in the raw, unstructured environment of early revival. But the more organized Pentecostalism became, the less visible her type of authority appeared. This tension raises a difficult question. Was Azusa Street a glimpse of what could have been, or a brief anomaly that institutional Christianity could not sustain? Lucy's life sits at the center of that question. When we revisit the image of Lucy's kitchen altar, it takes on deeper meaning. The kitchen was not merely a physical space. It symbolized emergence. It symbolized the place where women labored unseen. When Azusa Street erupted, it was not simply because a building opened. It was because hidden consecration had already taken place. The kitchen prepared what the mission displayed. Today, when historians recount the Azusa Street Revival, certain names dominate the narrative. William J. Seymour rightly receives recognition for his leadership and humility. His role was foundational, but movements are ecosystems. And ecosystems require more than one route. Lucy Farrow was one of those routes. Without her early experience of spirit baptism in Houston, without her prayer ministry in Los Angeles, without her courage to lay hands on seekers across racial lines, without her willingness to travel and spread the message, the revival story would look different. Yet her relative obscurity was something sobering about collective memory. We often remember what aligns with power structures. We forget what challenges them. Lucy's life challenges the assumption that influence requires visibility. It challenges the idea that leadership must be formally titled. It challenges the notion that history's loudest voices are its most formative. Her story forces us to confront how race and gender shape remembrance. And it compels us to ask whether modern movements are repeating similar patterns, celebrating platforms, while overlooking altars. By the time the initial intensity of Azusa Street began to wane, the Pentecostal movement was already spreading worldwide. Churches were planted, missionaries were sent, doctrines were codified. The visible blaze may have softened, but the embers were traveling. Lucy Farrow's name may not have appeared on denominational charters, but her fingerprints were embedded in the movement's DNA. And perhaps that is the deeper mystery of revival. The most transformative forces are often the least celebrated. The ones who kneel longest are not always the ones most remembered. As we move into the final section, we will explore Lucy Farrow's lasting impact, not just on Pentecostal history, but on the question of hidden faithfulness itself. What does her life teach us about legacy, recognition, and the quiet spaces where world-changing fire is born? History often remembers the explosion. It rarely remembers the kneeling. By the time the early intensity of the revival at Azusa Street Mission began to settle into structured denominations and organized fellowships, the names most frequently repeated were those who stood visibly at the center. William J. Seymour remained the recognized face of Azusa Street. His humility, his leadership, his entrance under criticism became part of Pentecostal legend. But behind the legend stands a quieter question. What happens to the ones who helped ignite the flame? What becomes of the woman whose kitchen prayers prepared the ground? Lucy Farrow did not fade because she lacked significance. She faded because hidden builders often do. Pentecostalism did not remain a small Los Angeles phenomenon. Within a few decades, it had spread across continents. Missionaries carried the message of spirit baptism and speaking in tongues to Africa, Latin America, Europe, and Asia. Churches multiplied rapidly. What began in modest rooms with wooden planks and borrowed chairs evolved into denominations, Bible schools, publishing houses, and global networks. Today, hundreds of millions of Christians around the world trace theological and spiritual lineage back to the early 20th century outpourings associated with Azusa Street. The growth is undeniable, but here is what makes Lucy Farrow's story so compelling. The global movement can be measured. Her hidden intercession cannot. You can count churches. You can calculate membership. You can track missionary expansion. But how do you measure the impact of a kitchen altar? How do you quantify the effect of a woman who prayed until heaven felt near? You cannot. And that is precisely the point. Lucy's life forces us to rethink how we define spiritual success. In modern culture, visibility is often mistaken for impact. Social media followers, conference invitations, book deals, and institutional titles become markers of influence. Lucy had none of those. She had prayer. She had surrender. She had boldness to lay hands on seekers when culture insisted she remain silent. Her authority did not come from position. It came from presence, and presence cannot be manufactured. The kitchen altar becomes more than a historical anecdote. It becomes a theological statement. God responds to surrendered hearts. The stove corner can become as sacred as the sanctuary. The quiet house meeting can carry as much weight as the public crusade. Lucy's story reminds us that revival is not engineered from stages. It is birthed in secret. One of the most sobering aspects of Lucy Farrow's life is how little detailed documentation remains about her later years. Compared to her male contemporaries, the historical record grows thin. There are no widely circulated memoirs, no large institutional archives bearing her name, no towering monument marking her resting place, and yet her legacy is alive. Every time believers gather to pray expectantly for spiritual renewal, they echo something Lucy embodied. Every time a woman steps forward in bold spiritual authority, despite cultural resistance, she walks a path Lucy helped clear. Every time racial barriers are challenged in the name of spiritual unity, Azusa Street whispers again. Lucy Farrow may not have institutionalized her influence, but she incarnated it. An influence embodied is often more enduring than influence branded. Lucy's life is not merely history. It is confrontation. It confronts how we assign value. It confronts how movements remember. It confronts how race and gender shape visibility. It confronts our obsession with public recognition. Why do some names become household references while others remain footnotes? Why do we celebrate the pulpit but overlook the prayer closet? Why does the narrative of revival often center on a single heroic figure when movements are always collective? Lucy Farrow stands as a quiet corrective. She reminds us that history is rarely driven by one voice. It is woven from many. And often, the strongest threads are the least visible. If you strip Azusa Street of its headlines and reduce it to its essence, what remains? Hungry people, persistent prayer, unexpected unity, courage to defy cultural boundaries. Lucy embodied all four. Her kitchen altar was not an accident of circumstance. It was a deliberate act of consecration. And perhaps that is the deepest secret behind the revival. Not the tongues, not the crowds, not the controversy, but the consecration. Because fire does not fall on convenience, it falls on surrender. Lucy Farrow surrendered, and history shifted. Imagine her again, not in a crowded mission hall, not in the middle of public controversy, but alone in that kitchen. The room is quiet, no reporters, no critics, no applause. Just a woman kneeling in ordinary space, whispering extraordinary prayers. She could not have known that within months, those prayers would spill into a global movement. She could not have known that her hands would help ignite one of the fastest growing expressions of Christianity in modern history. She could not have known that more than a century later, people would still trace spiritual lineage back to the meetings she helped shape. All she knew was that the altar mattered, and perhaps that is the final lesson of her life. You may never see the full impact of your hidden faithfulness. You may never receive the recognition history gives others. You may build in kitchens while others preach in pulpits. But if the fire is real, if the surrender is genuine, its influence will travel farther than you can imagine. Lucy Farrow's name may not echo as loudly as some, but her flame has not gone out. It burns in every revival prayer whispered in secret. It burns in every boundary crossed for the sake of unity. It burns wherever as someone chooses consecration over comfort. And that may be the greatest legacy of all. The revival on Azusa Street was visible, but the altar in the kitchen, that was the beginning. And beginnings, though often unseen, are where history is truly changed. In the end, Lucy Farrow's story is not just about Azusa Street. It is about the power of hidden obedience. It is about the kind of faithfulness that does not wait for applause, titles, or recognition. While history often magnifies the pulpit, Lucy reminds us that heaven responds to the altar, even if that altar is built in a kitchen corner. She may not have had a platform with her name on it, but her prayers helped ignite a movement that would circle the globe. Her hands, lifted in quiet surrender, helped shape a revival that still burns more than a century later. And maybe that is the greatest legacy of all. Unseen faithfulness can produce undeniable fire. If this story stirred something in you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more powerful untold histories, share it with someone who needs this reminder, and drop a comment below. What part of Lucy Farrow's story impacted you the most?